we have now arrived at the end of our conference. To each one of you, thanks a lot. There are always high points, and this seems to be a meeting that's made up of high points. For surely it's a wonderful thing to get together and exchange ideas and find out what we're doing in each one of our local groups, and to find that other people are doing some of the things we are, but that they have new ways of doing it and that we can profit by those. It's also lots of fun to get together and eat and talk and sing. We raised a higher pitch somehow as we sat down to eat than we did when we hit the singing. By that time we had had something to sustain us and we could get back to normal again. That was fun. And now it is a great pleasure to me, personally, to be able to present to you a person that I know you have gotten to think a great deal of in the little time that she has been here, and one whom I have admired from both near and far for some years. Dr. Dora V. Smith is a very busy person. And when I tell you that one weekend she flies to Utah or Denver or wherever it may be, that the next weekend she'll probably be in Boston, and that the following weekend she may be in Tallahassee, and that one of those weekends was reserved for us in Indiana, you'll know that it was indeed a treat for me to be able to say to our committee, Dr. Smith has accepted our invitation to come. She is very active in many kinds of work and in many groups. Perhaps you have known more about her through her work on the National Council of English Teachers. And I recommend to you whatever that group puts out in the way of the printed page. I would like to tell you a story and then present Miss Smith. Recently, I was visiting in a kindergarten when a little kindergartner came up to me and said, "See this book? Read it to me. I mean this picture." And I said, "Well, you wrote it and you drew it. Why don't you tell me?" And he said, "You're the one that can read." So I muscled all my forces, and I said, and read on as well as I could the story that was obvious to me. When I got all through, he said, "That ain't what it says." In this day and age, when educators are constantly being challenged for the ideas and the things they say, I urge that you listen very attentively, that you really learn the kinds of things Miss Smith believes, so that at any time you can rise up and say, "I think I understand what Miss Smith is saying through the writing and the words that she uses." It is indeed a pleasure for me to present to you Dr. Dora V. Smith, who is a teacher who really loves to teach and challenge her students. Dr. Smith.
Dr. Sorensen and friends in the Indiana ACEI. It's always a great privilege for anyone who is interested in teaching the language arts to be handed a topic such as I have this afternoon, language and literature in child development. We have just finished in the National Council of Teachers of English, Volume 1 of a 5-volume series of books on teaching the language arts. They represent the field from the preschool through the graduate school. I happen to be director of the program, and one of the greatest difficulties we had was to get people from the preschool and the graduate school to sit down together and to try to put down on paper what happens to a youngster in the language arts from the time when he meets the preschool teacher until he arrives in the graduate school. We felt that no program could be created in the language arts which wasn't rooted and grounded in the development of boys and girls, whether those boys and girls happen to be in the preschool or the graduate school. There is one sentence in our report that I like particularly. It begins this way. Language is not something one accumulates in the back of his head to pull out as needed. Language is reacting to a situation. In other words, it is a social instrument, and one cannot learn language apart from the use he makes of it in association with other human beings and in pursuit of problems with which he personally is concerned. I remember when one of the supervisors in Madison, Wisconsin, asked the elementary teachers to list in order of cruciality the difficulties they had in teaching language in the elementary school. The thing that interested me was that such problems as differences between saw and seen dropped to 6th place in the list of difficulties. The first one, which you'll recognize, was fear of saying anything at all. And the second one, which you will recognize equally well, was this: wanting to talk all of the time without having anything to say. Now, those are the real problems of the language arts, and that is the setting in which you and I have to teach it if we really believe that control over language is a part of the normal growth of boys and girls. It was my privilege to spend 9 weeks in all kinds of schools in New York State working on the New York Regents Inquiry. In one town in upstate New York, I found a kindergarten in the morning composed of the city children, and in the afternoon, one composed of youngsters whose parents worked on the estates of the children who went in the morning to kindergarten. So I went to the afternoon kindergarten because many of these little farm children had been in school for 1 week only. They were not accustomed to associating with other children. A little boy came in, whispered something to the teacher. She said, "Tommy, will you tell us that when we have afternoon news?" And he nodded that he would. Well, 15 little children sat down in a circle on the floor, and the teacher said, "Boys and girls, Tommy has something to tell us." Well, Tommy's jaw dropped down into his chest, and he couldn't have told it if his life had depended on it. Now, exercises to loosen the jaw won't help Tommy. The only thing that will help Tommy is getting acquainted with other children so that he feels a part of the group and is able to make some kind of contribution. The very next day, I was in a kindergarten in Rochester, New York, 45 little youngsters sitting around in the afternoon when they had afternoon news. And the teacher said, "Boys and girls, Billy has something to tell us." I shall never forget Billy. He arose with all the poise in the world, and he looked around at the 45 little children, and he said, "I hope that what I am going to tell you, children, won't make you sad." In other words, he was so much at home with that group that he knew that when he told them that his father had caught his arm in a machine in the factory that morning and had to have it amputated, would make those children sad. Now, every youngster we have in school, regardless of the level, is somewhere between Tommy over here and Billy over here. And one of the biggest problems of teaching the language arts is getting the child just as far up that ladder as possible. And it won't do any good to do exercises for one purpose or another until that thing is accomplished, until he really begins to feel that he belongs to a group. I have a friend whose little boy didn't like oatmeal. One morning at breakfast, he said, "Mother, why do we always have oatmeal?" She said cheerfully, "Why, Jim, because we like it." And he looked very much puzzled, and after a while he said, "But Mother, aren't I part of the we?" So it seems to me that the first principle of growing language power is to help boys and girls to feel as if they're a part of the we. Then they will have something to say, and then they will begin to be concerned with the best manner of saying it. Our problem always has to go in that direction, from the social and the psychological to the linguistic, not the other way around. Now, a second point that I'd like to make is this, that if positive growth is going to occur in the use of language, We have to help boys and girls learn how to express themselves. We have to work at it positively. You know, for years in the schools of this country, we have tested composition. We haven't taught it. We have said, here's the subject, now you write. And then we have ruined our eyesight sitting up nights correcting the mistakes that we didn't prevent. Now we are beginning to feel that what happens before a child writes or speaks is infinitely more important than anything that happens to what he has said after it has been given to the group. I think of a group of youngsters I had in the 7th grade who had been at camp in the summer, and they came back, and I didn't want to say, now we're going to write about something I did this summer, because they don't like to do that. So I said, do you have any friend that you wish might have been at camp with you? Oh, yes, they all had. So we decided that we would write letters to those friends, urging them to come to camp the next summer. And we began talking about what enticing things did happen in camp. We made a list of them. And those who thought of more gave hints to those who hadn't thought enough. And before we got through, we all had respectable lists of the things that we thought would entice our friends. Then we did a little reading, and we saw that words can create pictures, just as well as some of the ads we had for camps. And we could entice people by the pictures we could create in words of what had happened in our camp. And so we went on. We even took a sentence like this. After the setting up exercises, the boys went down to the beach to bathe. And under it I wrote the sentence, the professor went up on the platform to make a speech. And we said, what is the action in those two sentences? They said, went. Well, is there any difference in the action? By using the same word, we have said that those two actions were the same. And they were quite disgusted. And so they began thinking up better words that would not only tell that the boys went, but that would picture how they went. And some of them said they hurried, some of them said they ran, some said they dashed, and some said they raced. And then we began to dramatize what it is to hurry and what it is to dash and what it is to race. One person said they skipped. One boy said, oh, that won't do. That's a sissified word. Well, we said, how do you like hurry? Oh, they said, hurry is what you do when you have only 5 shopping days left till Christmas. There was no compulsion at all here. Well, how do you like ran? That's pretty good. How do you like dashed? That's better. Takes more wind to dash than to run. Well, how do you like raced? Well, that's better still. Why? Because somebody was trying to get there first. Well, you see, we developed vocabulary. We saw how words could do our bidding if we got the right word to express what we were dealing with. Well, we went on. We did a lot more things. Finally, we wrote. Do you suppose any youngster in that class chewed his pencil? Not one. They all were just raring to go by the time we got to that point, and they wrote their letters. Then we read them to ourselves, and we read them to each other. We talked about which letters would get us if we hadn't been to camp, and then we mailed them. Well, we did the same sort of thing with an experience we had watching football on the campus, and I'll never forget one of the very weakest boys in the class said to me, can I take this home to show to my dad? I was very much pleased and said, of course he could. He brought it back on Monday, and he paid me a sort of dubious compliment from his point of view, which I've never been able to forget. He said, Dad says that you must be some composition teacher if you could get that out of me. Now, that is what you and I are trying to do when we develop language power. Help children to get things out of themselves that they didn't know were there. Now, that's the reason that I say what we do before children write or speak is much more important than anything we do afterward. Now, at this point, I always realize how important it is to interrelate literature and writing, because literature is the successful expression of experience. And particularly if we can find literature that deals with things that boys and girls know about, they will learn a respect for one of their own experiences well recorded. I have a favorite poem from Dorothy Aldous that I like to use in the kindergarten or first grade. I like to use it because it's just about clothes hanging on the line. There isn't any youngster we could ever have in school who wouldn't have seen clothes hanging on the line. Therefore, he's in a position to be a literary critic, so far as Dorothy Aldous is concerned. The second stanza goes this way: stockings twisting in a dance, pajamas very tripping, and every little pair of pants upside down and skipping. Now, there are two things important about that poem. One is that children learn a respect for poetry when they see what a poet can do with a very ordinary experience. The other is that clothes will look different to them on the line as long as they live. And that's what literature's for, that interaction in the language arts program of having our own experience enriched by seeing it through the eyes of the imagination, and then getting a little courage from a poem like that about trying our own hands at writing something of the same sort. You remember Browning said in one of his poems, "We love first when we see them painted, things we have oft passed by." That ought to be one of the major functions of poetry in the elementary school. Now, this morning somebody said something about what should you do about rhythm. First, you have to see that, as we said this morning, that a poet is a person with a seeing eye and a listening ear. The background we build is not on the techniques of poetry, but on appreciating our own experience and recreating it with the power that words have if we find the right words. But we can't miss the music. Did you ever think about that little poem? Mrs. Peck Pigeon is pecking for bread. Bob, bob, bob goes her little round head. Well, you can't teach that poem to little children without their discovering that it follows exactly the movement of that pigeon's head. That's all rhythm is in poetry, and it's all a technique that youngsters need to understand. In Minneapolis, the Shrine puts on a circus every year. I often wonder if the men know what a service they do to the public schools. I never have a circus book or a circus poem left in my office during that particular week. Now, there are poems galore about the circus that the children love. I want to use two of them as an example to show how we can interrelate writing and reading. Now, one of them is Rachel Field's poem called The Elephant, or it's called Gunga by the elephant's name, and the other one is called The Circus Seal. Now, I'd say to the children, if we were going to read this, if you were going to write a poem about an elephant, would you make the lines long and slow and heavy, or would you make them light and short and skipping? And they look as if they were surprised that anybody would ask the question. Why, of course, long and slow and heavy. Now we can say, I guess you're more of a poet than you thought you were, because that's exactly what the poets do. Now listen. With wrinkled hide and great frayed ears, Gunga the elephant appears. Colored like city smoke he goes, as gingerly on blunted toes as if he held the earth in trust and feared to hurt the very dust. Moves just the way the elephant moves. And if you say to the children, on which words can you feel that elephant's great big foot going down? They'll tell you, dust and trust. And which picture shows an elephant just exactly as you have seen him? And they'll always say, with wrinkled hide and great frayed ears. Now, if you were going to write a poem about a circus seal, would you want the same kind of music? No, they say. If you had to pick out one word that would describe what you think of when you think of a seal, what would it be? And they always say slippery. How could you make a poem slippery? Well, we discover that sometimes a poet uses the same letter, and especially if it's the letter L that slides along. Remember when Tennyson wanted to express the the sailing out of this life into the next, he said people were going to the island valley of Avilion. They slid right out on those words. Another way is to make your lines so short that the meaning carries over, doesn't end. You have to keep on going until you get to the end of the thought. Well, here is Rachel Field's poem on the circus seal. Now, the elephant poem looks like this on the printed page, and the seal poem looks like this. Who is so proud as not to feel a secret awe before a seal that keeps such wet and sleek repose while twirling candles on his nose? Now, that's literature. It's also composition. We can't separate the two, because all that poetry is the effort of somebody to share what is in his mind's eye or to share what is in his heart so that we will feel as he does, or so that we will see what he has seen. I am particularly fond of Murray Applegate's little book called Helping Children Write. I particularly like the little poem in the very front of it. It's called Treasures. Little boys' pockets hold amazing things: fish worms, apple cores, a mess of strings. But this treasure is nothing to the wealth one finds in little boys' hearts and little boys' minds. Now, the job of both literature and writing, creative writing, is to bring out some of those things. Now, I want to reveal a third factor in the relationship of language and literature to development of boys and girls, and that is to help see how language power grows. I'm going to take as an illustration vocabulary, because that's something that's rather easy to get hold of. It was once my privilege to watch a child from the age of 18 months right on up as he learned language. I learned more from him than I ever learned out of textbooks in school. When he was 2 years old, he'd run down to the pond and he'd say, "Look, ducks, 2 ducks." The first stage in the development of vocabulary is to extend the number of things with which children are familiar. That's the reason that use of the dictionary is never the major road to vocabulary increase. The major road to the increase of vocabulary is to extend the experience of children and help them to add new words to their vocabularies through new experience. This same little child standing on the front seat of the car, when he heard the engine begin to rumble, would turn around and say to us in the back seat, "Fun." He didn't know that he was on a higher level of vocabulary than when he said ducks. He was generalizing. He had begun to think that that sound denoted some kind of fun. Then one day I got into the same kind of problem with him that I'm sure the chemistry teacher used to get into with me in high school. I told him I was going to bring him something from Chicago, and when he said, "What is it?" I said, "That's a secret," not stopping to think that he didn't know what that word meant. He said, "What's a secret?" How could you tell him? How could I tell a 2-year-old what a secret is? No amount of help from the dictionary would ever make it possible for me to explain that to a child who had never experienced a secret. So when I brought it back, what happened was that I just happened to bring some little tin animals out of which he could make mud pies. And he opened the package with great glee and said, "Timothy Turtle and old Mr. Bullfrog." He gave them the names of storybook animals. And the night before, we had had a cricket on the hearth. And he had evidently decided that a secret was going to be like a cricket. So after he had opened the whole package, he turned around to me and said accusingly, "But where's the secret?" When I got back to Minneapolis, I said to Guy Bond, "How could I tell that child what a secret is?" He said, "I'm afraid you're up against it. You'll have to bring him 6 presents from Chicago to establish the generalization." Now, that's the way language grows. this experience bringing meaning into the word, another experience bringing meaning in, and so on. Out of the richness of the background which we furnish boys and girls, words begin to attain meaning, particularly if they are generalized words like secret. Well, this same child came up to visit at a Wisconsin lake. You and I couldn't conceive of a time when we had never seen round water. But this child was familiar with water coming out of the faucet. He had seen rivers, but here was a lake. And whenever a visitor came, he would toddle down to the shore and say, "Look, that's the kind of water that you call a lake." You could just see the wheels going round in his mind. Well, that's the way we have to build meaning into words. First, water coming out of the faucet, then water in the rivers, then water in the lakes, going on from year to year in school, giving a greater depth of meaning to the same word. Mr. Jersild at Columbia did an interesting study with the word strike. He asked children in every grade level from the kindergarten through high school to define the word strike. Well, the little children said a strike is what you do to somebody that you don't like. And then you got up into the fourth grade, and a strike was the time when you went out after missing 3 balls, and so on. Then you got up to a level where children said a strike is when men walk up and down the sidewalk with boards on their backs, or when they throw rocks at each other in the street. And it wasn't until you got way high in the program that boys and girls began to realize that a strike was a clash between 2 major elements in our economic system. In other words, that business of experience being read into a word constantly is a part of the job of all of us at all levels. Now, this same little child coming to the North Shore when he was about 9 years old heard us say in the car to his father, "Oh, that's a Finnish bath." He looked very much puzzled, and pretty soon he said, "Why do they call it a Finnish bath? Is it because it's the last one he'll ever have?" I don't know whether he was envious or not. But at any rate, he knew about the Finns in the war. The minute we said that, he said, "Oh, yes," he remembered about the Finns. But he had never come across the word Finnish, and he didn't associate it at all with the Finns and the kind of baths that they had imported to our North Shore. We're never through building vocabulary. By extending our experience with the things words stand for, by reading a greater depth of meaning into the same word, by coming up against new meanings for old words, and finally by building generalizations out of a great many experiences. That's how language is related to child development. Now, in other words, the development of language is not like laying brick upon brick in building a wall. We've had great trouble in our National Commission with the requests that we say what shall be the minimum requirements in the 3rd grade and the 4th grade and the 6th grade and the 7th grade. And we say, but we began with a description of the growth of children from the preschool through the graduate school, and if there's any one thing that that story tells us, it is that there is no possibility that all the children can possibly be at the same stage of growth in any year. And the man who wrote the chapter says nobody would be foolish enough to say, now, in the first year, this tree must grow 1 branch. In the next year, it'll grow another. And in the 3rd year, the 3rd branch is the mark of the 3rd year of that tree's existence. Growth of a tree is dependent upon the richness of the soil, the absorption of as much as possible from the atmosphere, and the development whole of something that we're all interested in, that grows as a unit by much soil, sunshine, attention, pruning where necessary, and finally grows something that is an entity and not composed of bricks that are fastened together in a wall. Now, that is the idea that we've tried to put in to our National Language Arts program. Now, how do skills come into this, and how do we see that some things grow? I had great sympathy with the people in the morning session who wanted us to see to it that we gave children specific help. I personally don't believe that we grow language by leaving children alone. I think we grow language by giving them all kinds of positive help. Let me give you an illustration from a kindergarten in Kansas City. It was Easter time, and the teacher had a little white bunny in the kindergarten. She let every child feel the bunny. She said, "Boys and girls, what did the bunny feel like?" One little girl said, "It feels swell." Another little girl said, "It feels fine." And still another one said, "It feels nice." Now, if that teacher had stopped there, the first-hand experience would have grown no language power. And that's where I think teaching is tremendously important. We are there to set the stage for language growth. No amount of first-hand experience will grow the kind of language power that we have to grow unless we attach to it verbal rehearsal of that experience under expert guidance. So the teacher said, "But boys and girls, listen, what does the bunny feel like?" And they went into a brown study, and pretty soon one little girl came up and said, "It feels like silk." I wish you could have seen the expression that came over the faces of those kindergarten children. Every one of them knew that that was exactly the word to express what he had felt. Now that's what we're trying to do. Help boys and girls to find the best words to share the experiences they're having. I was in a 5th grade class in Minneapolis who had just returned from seeing how offstage noises are made at a radio station. One of the children was telling us how a storm was made. He said, "You know that thing in the bucket of water." Well, the teacher said, "How could a thing in a bucket of water be a storm?" Then another youngster tried. He said, "Oh, he means that stick in the bucket of water." And again the teacher said, "How could a stick in a bucket of water be a storm?" And finally a third youngster said, "He means that paddle wheel in the bucket of water." Different combinations of soil, air, light, sunlight, water. And I happened to be there the day when these things came out. Some of them were sorry-looking sights, all white and stringy. One was bushy and wonderful. The children recited. They hardly knew what they were saying. One said, "Oh, look at his, it's the most tallest of all. Oh, look at his is more taller than ours." And they went on, having great difficulty with one of the most difficult points in our language, the problem of comparing beans, not adjectives or adverbs, but beans. And so they went on and talked about science. She didn't stop them in the middle of the science lesson. They established the generalizations that they wanted to establish in science, and when that was over, she said, "Boys and girls, I noticed as we were talking about those beans that we were having trouble with comparing things in English." She said, "I'd like to have the tallest boy in the class come up here and the littlest girl." She said, "Now, who will make us a sentence showing how tall Henry is in comparison with Marion?" And one boy said, "Henry is more taller than Marion." Then the teacher said, "Will somebody else try?" And somebody else said, "He is more tall than Marion." Somebody else said, "He is taller than Marion." And they discovered that when you're comparing two things in English, you never use both more and ER. You choose between the two. And then they began comparing shades of blue and size of pictures and various things around the room. Then she asked for a middle-sized person to come up, stand between the two, and they tried it again for 3 things. Henry is the tallest. Henry is the most tallest, and so on. They discovered that there are 2 ways of saying that in English. He is the tallest or he is the most tall, but never both. And so they worked on that problem, which had arisen right out of the science lesson. But they took time out. Call it a language lesson if you want to, or call it a remedial lesson. They took time out to consider what it was about language that was causing them trouble and to try to fix a few habits. Now, I want to turn further to this question of literature. I tried to show in connection with poetry that poetry takes an imaginative approach to human experience, and therefore it enriches life for boys and girls. It also helps boys and girls to understand the power of words to recreate experience for us. Now, what else does literature do? I'm a great believer in the fact that today teacher training institutions should develop programs in children's literature that are really programs in book selection. So the teachers may be trained not only in the 16 must-haves before the 8th grade, but in all the good, wholesome books, which ought to be used to extend experience of boys and girls and to give them joy in reading. Now, what are some of the areas in which we want boys and girls to have their awareness extended? Well, one of them, for example, might be their awareness of boys and girls of other lands. We have in every great publishing house in the country today a children's editor whose business it is to find the people who can interpret boys and girls of other lands to our children. Time was when Lucy Fitch Perkins used to sit down in Boston and write the Eskimo twins and the South American twins and the Dutch twins and so on. Nobody could get by with that today. The first question that any editor will ask is, how long have you lived in the country about which you're writing? What do you have to say to American boys and girls about it? So people do not write about all countries, they write about the country they know best. Take Kate Sherody, for example. Kate Sherody, who has written The Good Master for our older boys and girls, a superb book about children who do in Hungary the kinds of things boys and girls do here, but do other things too by reason of living in Hungary. Little girl whose mother has died, she lives in hotels with her father, and she becomes unbearable to herself and to other people. Finally, the father asks his brother, who lives on a farm, if he'll take the little girl in and make her a member of the family. Things have always gone very smoothly in that family because the little boy has always lived as a cooperating member. The very first night, Kate gets up in the rafters and eats the sausages that are hung up there for their winter's supply. The little boy is all eyes as he sees her, and meantime the mother has built a fire in the old Nuremberg stove, and Kate can't get down. The father looks up, he says, a very good place for little girls who eat the winter's sausages, and they all go to bed, and the little boy is wide-eyed, and there's Kate. Well, next morning when the little boy wakes up, Kate is in her bed. Nobody knows what happened, but she begins her road to becoming a cooperative member of that family. In the end, she gets a beautiful white horse and goes riding with the little boy, and you discover that the father had had a talk with her that night about what it means to be a member of that family, and that if she ever does become one, she will have a white horse that is all her own. I'm glad that the best story of democratic family life in existence did not come out of the United States. It's good for our boys and girls to know that this is an Hungarian family, and a very beautiful story and an entertaining story that youngsters like. Or I think, for example, of Louise Rankin's Daughter of the Mountains. You know, it's interesting what the things are that make the children of the world kin. One is love of a dog. This little girl in the mountains of Tibet was given a golden-haired dog by the priests of the temple. That dog is stolen and carried off on a caravan down into Calcutta. She follows. You have a marvelous description of life in that country. She gets to the home of an English woman to whom the dog has been sold, and the English woman says, well, it'll be easy enough to find out whether this is your dog. Just stand here in the hall and call him. And down the stair rolls this little ball of gold, jumps into her arms, and she has her dog back. That's one of the things that we try to do. We don't say now in reading this story we're going to get acquainted with India or Tibet. Maybe we start with dogs. And then we discover that there are dogs in other countries than the United States and that children love them. One that I like to start with for little children is birthdays. I believe that into every primary room into which there comes a birthday cake, there should come a birthday story or a birthday poem. Think, for example, of Manuela's birthday in old Mexico. Now, Manuela's a little girl of 5. What did she want for her birthday? Why, a doll, of course. And so you see that beautiful picture of Mexican life with the love of a doll that makes little girls kin the world over. Or what did Pepper Moon in China want for his 5th birthday? Why, a dog, of course. And it's bad enough in the United States to persuade father and mother to give one a dog. But suppose you had to put the problem to a family conclave presided over by grandmother. That's what happened to Pepper Moon. Grandmother said, yes, every little boy should have a pet, but a dog. That was something else again. So the conclave decided that Pepper Moon should have a canary for his birthday. You may imagine how Pepper Moon liked that. So he started swapping that canary for first one animal and then another until finally he brought home a mangy old buffalo. And even grandmother decided that a dog would be better than that. Well, go over into Sweden and take Snip, Snap, Snore and the Red Shoes, the story of little boys who earned money to give their mother a present. Or take our own story, Ask Mr. Bear, what to give mother for her birthday. A birthday makes the children of the world kin. It seems to me that with the very littlest children, we can start with human experience and see it illustrated in every nation of the world. Now, what about the children who make up America? Leo Politi out in Los Angeles is giving us some beautiful books for the primary grades of the little Mexican children of Elvira Street. Juanita, who gets a white dove for her birthday, who takes it to the temple to be blessed in that lovely Latin American ceremony of the blessing of the toys there and the blessing of the pets. Or what about Emma Brock's one little Indian boy? You remember he got lost because he was more interested in an all-day sucker that he was sucking than in watching where he was going. That could happen in Muncie, Indiana. Well, take, for example, the little boy whose Auntie Katushka came from the old world to make poppy seed cakes. I think we ought to make a lot of the children who have foreign backgrounds. I happen to have been born astride the Atlantic, and I know what it means to me and has meant through my lifetime that my father and mother's family, all of them, were on the other side of the Atlantic. So I believe we should make much of that. Sometimes, perhaps I'm far enough from Boston to say that I'm quite proud of the fact that I am 270 years nearer my Mayflower than any daughter of the American Revolution. And I think we can do a great deal with that theme in helping our boys and girls to discover the peoples who make up America. Now, for the intermediate grades, look at the things that Lois Lenski has done. Blue Ridge Billy, Strawberry Girl down in Florida, the boy up in northern Michigan who swapped things constantly, copper-toed boots. And, no, that wasn't Lois Lenski. Texas Tommy and a great many others. Or take, for example, Marguerite D'Angeli, who did the other story of copper-toed boots up in northern Michigan. Or the Hannah, the little Quaker girl in Pennsylvania. She has given us any number of extraordinarily good books to show children the peoples who make up America. Leo Politi's most attractive little new book is called Little Leo. And little Leo goes with his father and mother to visit his grandparents in Italy, in a small town. And what do you suppose he takes with him? An American Indian suit. and little Leo dashing up the street in a little Italian village in an American Indian costume, the envy of all the little Italian boys, makes a delightful picture book for children in the United States. Now, family life is very interestingly revealed in literature for boys and girls. We have it at all levels. We have it, for example, in Poppy Seed Cakes. We have it in Juanita by Leo Politi. We have it in One Little Indian Boy, because the parents are so concerned about the little boy that is lost. We have it in Make Way for Ducklings for the little children, because we go into the animal world for family life with them. But we have an amazing array of family life stories for the intermediate grade children. I think, for example, of the Moffats. You remember the little girl in the Moffats? When she gets tired of looking at life the way we all have to look at it, just stands on her head and sees it from another angle. You have a very remarkable story in the family life of the Moffats. And this morning I referred to another book of the same sort, Ginger Pie. One of the most curious situations in that story is the fact that Uncle Benny is 3 years younger than any of his nieces and nephews, and therefore is quite a hero in the neighborhood. Everybody calls him Uncle Benny. Or you have Elijah the Fishbite. The minister's family believed in giving their animals names they wouldn't be ashamed of when they grew old. So they called the cow Methuselah, and then they thought they would call the cat Elijah. Elijah the Tishbite. And the mother said, well, at the rate at which he eats fish, you ought to call him Elijah the Fishbite. Then follows one of the most interesting stories I think I've ever read. These children, quite naturally, decide to baptize the cat on a Sunday afternoon when the church is vacant. They just get up to the baptismal font when in walks the woman of this little town who pays the largest share of the minister's salary and who gave that baptismal font to the church. Well, you may imagine what happens. The rest of the story is concerned with the activities of the children in the minister's family to win over this woman whom they have alienated. They have a most interesting family conclave. Baptizing the cat is not at all condoned, and they really try to work out something they can do to make up for it. It's a very funny and very interesting story. Well, I could go on and on with these wholesome, good stories of family life. Let me take Caddy Woodlawn for the older children, because Mrs. Brink happens to be a neighbor of mine. Caddy is a fascinating story of a family of 2 boys and a girl, and a smaller girl who has no companion because her sister, her own age, has died. And even although it's set in pioneer days, you have a wholesome picture of family life. There is another problem in that story that makes it even more valuable, I think. I think it's a shame to classify a good story under one category. I always groan a little bit when Caddy Woodlawn gets classified as a pioneer story, because it's the most wonderful story I know of a girl who didn't want to grow up to be a lady. And there are a lot of such girls. So this has real value for an individual child. She gets into all kinds of trouble because she is a tomboy. And finally, her father, she has to be punished for some of it, and her father goes up to her bedroom and changes her idea of what it means to be a lady. And she bows to the inevitable. Well, that kind of incident in a story is very interesting. Or take Elizabeth Janet Gray's Jane Hope, story of a girl who is a tomboy because her older sister is such a successful society belle. She knows that she never will be able to compete with her sister on her sister's terms, so she creates a personality for herself by being a tomboy. If a girl is in that situation, it's interesting for her to read that book and to see whether her reason for being a tomboy, or rather for continuing to be a tomboy, may be the same. Then there's a little love story in the end of it, which the older children like. I had an interesting experience with a college girl in my course in adolescent literature for junior and senior high school teachers. She said, I want to read Jane Hope because I read it when I was a girl, and I used Jane Hope's standard of measurement when I got engaged, and I want to reread it and see if the man lives up to it. So the next day I was quite busy in the office when she appeared in the doorway. I looked up and she didn't wait to see me, but she hailed me this way and she said, he does, and off about her business. Now, you and I have no idea what books can do for individuals. I think, for example, of a boy who is passionately interested in horses and knows more about horses than about anything else. Think what you and I could do for him in the development of a love of reading. Take Marguerite Henry's album of horses that will give him excellent pictures and tell him all that he wants to know about the great horses of the racetracks. Or take, for example, her book called King of the Winds, which is not only a remarkable horse story, but which is rich in the backgrounds of English life and Arabian life, which children will never forget. That story, it seems to me, is one that ought to be in every school library. Well, a psychologist said to me once that a woman rose in his class and said, Mr. McConnell, what would you do with a boy who's interested in nothing but aviation? And he said he got up and he began wringing his hands too. And he said, I thank the Lord that he's interested in aviation. Because if a boy shows interest in any one thing, and you are familiar with books, you can start him on the road to reading. And that, it seems to me, is what you and I are there for. Now, finally, I want to say that it seems to me that a lot of reading should be just for fun. If we narrow the reading of boys and girls to certain informative themes, they are going to go out and find for themselves cheap material to read. In the New York Regents Inquiry, we found in a city in western New York that had more money for books than any other community, an addiction to the Bobbsey twins and the Hardy Boys and the comics. The supervisor was much disturbed because he belonged to the Junior Literary Guild. He read the books. He really knew something about children's books. We began to try to find out what happened. Every fall, he had a display in his office of the new books. He'd lay them all out and say to the third grade teachers, come in and tell me which ones you want ordered. There aren't very many of us that have had that kind of experience. Well, what happened? They came in, somebody said, oh, here's a book about the railroad. Somebody else said, oh, here's a book about the creamery, and so on. And that was what they presented children with. No wonder they found the Bobbsey twins, because children love to read about other youngsters their own age, and therefore they delight in the Bobbsey twins, particularly, as one of them said, when the family life is so wonderful because no matter what they do, the parents never say anything. Now, we have to compete with that kind of thing in better books for boys and girls. We have many of them of that kind. We have many exciting books that youngsters will read for the excitement. I think of My Father's Dragon, which is one of my favorites for about the fourth grade level. A most amazing mystery which children will read right straight through to the end because they love it. Or I think, for example, of Homer Price, who started the donut machine going in a store and then couldn't stop it, and then had to think up ways of getting all those donuts sold. We ought to have a lot of reading of that sort that is for nothing but a good time, because that is the basis on which we are going to develop a personal habit of reading that will last through life. Well, you see why it seems to me that this whole program in the language arts is interrelated. We don't think of it as reading, writing, speaking, and listening. We think of it as the development of children in their capacity to use language for worthwhile purposes, and the development of children in their awareness of human experience, that through the use of literature and through their development of language, their own lives may be greatly enriched.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, and thanks to everyone who's been.